Welcome to Illuminating Catholics, podcast of the Diocese of Sioux City. I'm Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese. Together with Carmen Bauer of the Faith Formation Office, we will shed light upon topics of faith in the modern church. Our guests include Catholic clergy, religious sisters, and other experts in their fields to help us understand what's happening in the church today. We will explore issues, even the tough ones, and to find answers to common questions about Catholicism. Thank you for joining us for today's Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Welcome back to the Illuminating Catholics podcast. I am Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese of Sioux City.
And I'm Carmen Bauer, Director of Faith Formation for the Diocese.
In this season of Thanksgiving, we want to express our thanks to all of you for listening. Whether this is your first episode or you've been listening since our very first one just a year ago, we're most grateful for the nearly 15,000 downloads of the podcast since we launched in November 2024. And today, we invited our coworker, Cecilia Lopez, Diocesan archivist, to share our diocese history of caring for vulnerable populations in today's episode. If you're not aware, every diocese has the responsibility to preserve our history, which is where our archivist comes in. So we're really grateful to have her come over to this building and provide an awareness of this part of our diocesan heritage. Welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to our listeners being able to hear from you because you've shared so much around the office at different opportunities, and it's always so interesting. So just to jump in here, can you share with us a few of the early institutions that you'll focus on for this episode and maybe share how they were established in the diocese?
Well, I want to focus today on just three of those institutions. That would be the Good Shepherd Home for Girls, the St. Monica's Home for Unwed Mothers, and for St. Anthony's Orphanage. All of those were located here in Sioux City, but they served people from a very large area, not only our diocese, but some of the surrounding area as well. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we get into it. How we came to have these protective institutions from our earliest days is because of our first bishop, Bishop Garrigan. He was very, very conscious of the needs of this area. When he arrived, there was a great deal of poverty here because settlement was recent and was still happening because we had the meatpacking plants here. So there were a lot of immigrant communities who had just arrived and were working very hard, and they were struggling. And there were some more widespread difficulty. I mean, it wasn't just Sioux City by any means. There was a lot of poverty in the rural areas. Many people are unaware. We still had smallpox outbreaks happening in Plymouth County, focused on Lamar's. And the health effects of our climate are awful. I was very shocked to learn that many of our early priests actually died from what we would call exposure, that flu and tuberculosis just killed so many people because of how brutal our climate is. So things were tough. And so when he arrived, he was especially sensitive to the effects of poverty and hardship on babies and women in the community. Unfortunately, that had many tragic incidences here. Babies were often abandoned. Babies were getting abandoned in doorways. It sounds like Charles Dickens, but that was happening here. And usually they got found, and once in a while those infants died because they weren't found in time and it was winter. So it was a very tragic situation, and he wanted to respond to that, and also to help the mothers, help women who were in trouble in the area, because he was a pretty smart guy. He realized that if babies are in trouble, it means their moms and their families are in trouble. So he wanted to really address that.
And did Bishop Garrigan invite others to help him in this? And how did he get started in that?
Well, he did the smart thing, which was to invite the religious women. They were well-educated and well-organized, and they really knew how to get things done. So he invited several different communities of religious women to help out, and some of them were already here. Mother Gertrude, who I'll say more about in a few minutes, she was already here getting good stuff done when he arrived. So that was someone local he could draw on pretty much right away. She was a busy lady.
And what were his connections to Mother Gertrude in particular and some of the other religious orders?
Well, Bishop Garrigan came to us from actually Catholic University of America. It had been planned that this would become a diocese in 1902, and the bishop who was expected to come, it had been announced and everything, he unexpectedly died before getting installed as bishop here. So all of a sudden we're just about to launch this diocese, and we need a bishop. The archbishop in Dubuque, whose name was John Keene, knew then Monsignor Garrigan from Catholic University of America, because Archbishop Keene had connections there, and he spent time at CUA. So it looks like what happened is that the Archbishop said, I know a guy, and that's how we came to have Bishop Garrigan, who was a scripture scholar and an administrator at Catholic University. So when he arrived, Mother Gertrude and her Benedictine sisters were already here, but because of Archbishop John Keene, he had all these ties to Dubuque. And there was, of course, the Franciscan Mother House in Dubuque. It was a pretty big center for women religious and their leadership. So that was a phone call away, or a telegram away for him.
So when the religious orders, when he invited those sisters in, and they arrived, what was their purpose and their mission?
Well, I'd like to start with the Good Shepherd homes. The Good Shepherd sisters were committed to the care of young women. We would say now women at risk, vulnerable young women, and that was their goal. That was what they did, and they built a residential convent. So when we talk about Good Shepherd home, it was the sisters' home. It was a home for the young women they were assisting. It was also where they had a school, and more about that in a minute, because even here in Sioux City, hardly anybody knows that there was a high school here run by the Good Shepherd sisters. So they got the call from Bishop Garrigan to come help. They were the first of the sisters to arrive. And this part kind of blew my mind, because they arrived with nothing. They came on the train. They did not have any idea where they were going to spend the first night when they arrived. So they came and they begged. They begged on the streets. They begged at the parishes. They ended up renting a little tiny house from some of the Mercy sisters associated with the hospital here. And you're in trouble when you're so poor that you're poorer than the Franciscans and you're poorer than the Mercy sisters. They really came here with empty hands. It was just an extraordinary act of faith to come here with nothing. But there was a lot of support for what they were doing. There was a lot of recognition within the community that there were vulnerable young women who really needed help. And this was a dangerous place to be a single young woman. Sioux City was pretty rough. There's some ugly history there. So this is what they did. They reached out to the community. They were eventually able to build a large building that had housing for the young women. It had a convent for themselves. It had a chapel. It had classroom buildings. It also had an orchard and chickens and a great big garden. So there was plenty of outdoor opportunities there.
That's wonderful. And can you share with us a little bit more about the education of the young women?
Well, they set up their own high school there. It was called Sacred Heart High School. They issued their own transcripts, their own diplomas. We're very fortunate to actually have a couple of these diplomas. And this was an accredited, fully functional high school. Now, our records for this are not as perfect as I would like, and I'm going to probably say that a lot in the next half an hour.
It's okay.
Always, an archivist, we always wish there was more that survived. But we have really good records from the 50s and 60s of what was happening in that high school. And I was so impressed and so pleasantly surprised that these were professional track classes. These women were being encouraged to pursue what were available professional options for them at the time. They were encouraged to go to typist school, to learn to use early counting machines, to prepare themselves for business, for what we would call a pink collar job, because that was what was available then. And they had student government, they had theater, they had their own sports teams. So there were many, many opportunities for these young women to learn leadership, to exercise leadership. So it was very, very forward thinking in that sense.
Definitely. And you had kind of indicated earlier that the community was very supportive of this apostolate in this school. How was that demonstrated?
Well, a couple of different ways. They had good financial support from lay people, and that was all over the diocese. A lot of that was coming from women, women's parish groups, what were called sodalities, which were prayer and support organizations. We had lots of those before Vatican II, but if you're my age, you probably don't remember sodalities. It's a funny word, but they were social groups to do good and to pray together, and most of them were women. There was also a women's auxiliary for the convent, and they raised money. They donated books to the library, because of course if you have a high school you need to have a good library, so the women's auxiliary was contributing to that, and we know that because we have some photos that survive. But even earlier than that, like in 1930, there were six businessmen here in Sioux City who got together. Not all of them were Catholic, and they realized that they needed a new boiler to keep this home warm. It was a pretty big place, and so they got together and had a boiler drive to raise thousands of dollars to buy a boiler. And again, 1930, having a big fundraising drive, how ambitious that was and how committed they were, and how important they must have felt that to be raising money when the Great Depression just fell on them. So that was really very impressive. And we know it was from all over the diocese. Enough of our financial records survive to show that it was from small rural parishes, big places like Fort Dodge. They were all contributing to this very important work.
I think that's really interesting to think about that back then. You've got this group of women, underprivileged, and giving them a leg up, and that professional education and how everyone's come together. It's fascinating to me. It's like people were forward thinking. It's like, hey, if we invest a little bit in these young women, they can have good, productive lives.
And especially because maybe most of the young women who were there were coming there from the court system. Mm. There were courts that were dealing with what we would probably call minor crimes, but where these young women who were minors were either in trouble or headed for trouble. And a law changed in 1911 that gave courts in Iowa the discretion to send young women to the home instead of sending them to Mitchellville's Iowa training schools for girls, which was more of a reform school situation. So that's how many of these women came into Good Shepherd Home. But I want to emphasize that it was not fenced. There was no gate. They were not being held there in any sense of the word. There were it's hard to know exactly how the court system sort of kept tabs on them, because those records do not survive if we ever had them. But we know when they celebrated their 50-year anniversary, they invited and really thanked members of the court, members of the police, for being partners in their work.
That's interesting as well. And I'll bet that's an institution not a lot of people know about. I know I didn't. Cecilia, you had mentioned a second institution, the St. Monica's Home for Unwed Mothers, and also serving a vulnerable population. If you could share a little bit with us about the leadership there and how this was established.
Well, this was one where Mother Gertrude was able to draw on her expertise and the community of expert women that she had there with the hospital there in Sioux City. She was a formidable woman. She was really an amazing lady. She was born in 1864. She became a missionary in South Dakota as a Benedictine in 1881. And, if you crunch those numbers, you think, oh my gosh, how young was she when she became a missionary in South Dakota? And she was there for a while. She settled in Elkton, South Dakota with several sisters. She built a convent, a school, a hospital, and an orphanage, all of which burned down in 1897. Which was good for Sioux City because she and her sisters came here after that. And so that's how that little community of missionaries came to be in Sioux City. She built the community for a few years and then got working. She definitely did not wait for a new bishop to turn up. By 1901, they were providing housing for single women in the city. They had started St. Vincent's Hospital by 1907, the School of Nursing by 1910. So she was just an extremely capable administrator and leader. And it was because of the hospital that the bishop was interested in her being involved with St. Monica's and care for expectant mothers. Because again, this seems to have been a combination of Garrigan being very forward-thinking and also Mother Gertrude. He was very eager that women who might have been ostracized or stigmatized, that they should receive top-notch care, that they had Catholic doctors, Catholic nurses, dentists coming into the home and providing care from the earliest days. And again, when I learned this, I was so surprised because I think, okay, in 1910, most women were having their babies on the dinner table, that home births were very, very common. And as best I can tell, they had hospital births from the very beginning.
Again, forward thinking. I love those nuns. Just want to put a little shout out for religious women.
Absolutely.
You rock.
Absolutely. Now, Mother Gertrude didn't start from scratch. There was originally a lay apostolate here to address the situation because the situation was pretty dire, and that was actually started by lay people by renting houses. They rented a house in Riverside and outgrew it, and then they rented another house in Leeds and outgrew it, and then so that was about 1909 when they realized they really needed more space. So Mother Gertrude got the first house going in 1910, and that was sort of temporary. The bishop came to own a farm up in the northern part of Sioux City. It's actually a bit north of what's now just north of what's now the Country Club is where it was built. It's at the north end of what's now Hamilton Boulevard. And that's where a significant building was built. It was designed by William Steele, the architect, who designed so many of our churches and the county courthouse. And he was quite the notable architect, also a member of the cathedral parish.
Oh,
So in 1923, William Steele put together the designs for a state-of-the-art building, which was very much what the bishop wanted. But even before that building was completed in 1923, there was an organization from the Chamber of Commerce called the Samaritan Brotherhood, who got together to raise money for the home for unwed mothers. And this was Catholic and Protestant. There was very widespread support for this. We know this from the newspaper coverage that survives. And I actually have just a few numbers for that. So I know this because we have a newspaper clipping from 1926. And in 1926, it was covering the first 16 years that the home was opened, and there were 702 babies born during those 16 years.
Oh my.
And of those 702, 274 of them had been adopted. That was also a bit of a surprise. I expected that figure would be higher.
Certainly.
I did as well.
So, unfortunately, because of the strict confidentiality surrounding the situation at the time and the fact that so few records exist, we can't really say how many mothers and babies assisted. I mean, just based on this figure from 26, I assume it to have been thousands.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't really say for sure.
That's quite an impressive number in any case.
Yes, and women were coming from all over. We have very, very few records of the women themselves. But we know that they were coming from South Dakota, North Dakota, sometimes as far away as California. So all over the upper Midwest and sometimes from much further places. And I'd like to add, too, that even though we call it the Unwed Mothers Home, St. Monica's, it always welcomed women who needed help. You know, if they were married and were very, very poor and needed help, they could come to St. Monica's, they could stay there. Usually women would come, whenever they came, whenever they arrived. And normally they would stay 2 to 3 months after the birth of their child. So they would be cared for there in the home, and they would have the sisters and the nurses who were very experienced to help them learn how to be moms and learn how to take care of their infants. So they, again, I think that is, wow, that's so forward thinking for the 1920s.
Yes. You think of the pregnancy centers now and some of the parenting classes. I had no idea that wasn't a new new invention, so to speak. So, what wonderful work there.
Yes, so that was very nice. We noticed, of course, during the 1920s and 1930s is when the numbers picked up, and when there were more married women who needed their services.
And, as we are talking about caring for unwed mothers and the facilitation of adoptions, you mentioned that third institution, St. Anthony Orphanage. So was there a connection from St. Monica's home to the orphanage?
I would say there was a cooperative connection there, because St. Anthony's building was just enormous, and we'll get to that in a moment. It was a very big place, had lots of staircases. So sometimes there were little kids who were coming into St. Anthony's, and staircases and little kids don't mix too well. And sometimes there were sibling groups who were coming into St. Anthony's Orphanage, where the oldest one might be 8, but then the youngest one might be very young. So sometimes St. Anthony's would, accept a sibling group. They would have the older ones there in St. Anthony's, but the youngest ones would be at St. Monica's, because St. Monica's had the facilities to care for babies and toddlers and preschoolers.
Can you share with us a little bit about the lives of the orphans? You'd mentioned that they were different ages. Did they, where did they go to school? How long did they typically stay?
Well, let's say a couple of things about where they came from to start
mm-hmm.
with. They came to us originally from Dubuque. Before there was a diocese here, Catholic children who needed orphanage care, and non-Catholic children as well, were being put on the trains to Dubuque because there was a major orphanage in Dubuque that was run by the Franciscan sisters there. So, how I mentioned before that Bishop Garrigan wanted the experts, he was very concerned when the diocese set up that his kids, our kids at the diocese, were being sent to the other side of the state to be cared for. And he really felt very strongly that that wasn't good for anybody. So he started pushing, and by pushing I mean fundraising aggressively to build the orphanage by 1904. So basically he got the cathedral built enough to use it at least, if not quite finished, and started fundraising for the orphanage immediately. And that was often through Christmas collections, for its obvious connection to the Christ child needing a home. And throughout the diocese, but especially in Sioux City, he really, really wanted to see this happen. And it took a few years. He started fundraising in earnest in 1904. He was still fundraising in 1908. But the building was dedicated in 1910. So that's the same year as St. Monica's. It was also a William Steele building. And so the bishop, he was so happy. The bishop had a great big dedication ceremony, and for the ceremony, Franciscan sisters came on the train from Dubuque and then came directly to the new building, which was state-of-the-art and brick and very handsome. Again, Garrigan really wanted to do right by these kids. It was regularly inspected. It was up to code, such as it was at the time. So they worked hard to do this, and it turned out to be a good thing because they had to expand almost immediately.
So, looking at their lives, then, how were these children educated? How long was the stay? The average stay for a child, or did that really kind of depend?
By 1914, they had expanded into this very large building, and there was a great demand for this kind of care. They came for different reasons, so the length of stay varied a great deal. We're fortunate that we have pretty good records from St. Anthony's, and I recently found out that the Franciscan sisters don't have a whole lot of records, so that the records that we have are pretty much unique, which is all the more precious as we care for them in the archives. The reasons that they came varied a great deal. Often it was because of housing, inadequate housing, places burned down. It was because there had been an injury or loss of a parent, flooding. There were all kinds of serious family disruptions that meant kids needed care. And one of the things to bear in mind when we talk about St. Anthony's is that it was short-term care. When we use the term orphan today, we usually mean a child who has lost their parents and is eligible for adoption. And that was not the case for the decades that St. Anthony was providing care. Almost all of the children who were cared for in St. Anthony's had living parents, had living family who, for one reason or another, were temporarily unable to care for their kids. So digging in the records, what we see is that sometimes kids stayed a week, sometimes kids stayed a month. Rarely, but sometimes children would stay for years. And again, often that's a situation where we'd like to have more information, and that information is just not recorded, because what we think of as a case history really hadn't been invented quite yet.
And was it mostly staffed by the sisters, or were there other professionals from other areas?
It was mostly staffed by the sisters, and these were sisters who had worked in the orphanage in Dubuque and then come here. So they were experienced, they were specialized in their ministry, we would say now. The lay people that were assisting and that were associated with all of these institutions was Catholic Charities. Now, I can't give you a history of Catholic Charities. That would make a really great broadcast because they did so much. But Catholic Charities was involved with St. Anthony's from the beginning. Yep. They weren't administrators, but they were associated, and on those rare occasions when there was an adoption, they would be involved with that. Because even back in the day, there was a fair amount of legal paperwork that was involved, and they were very good about negotiating that. That was also true for St. Monica's, where they were very involved with the adoption process there, and also getting these women ready to go and having a good place to go when they left St. Monica's.
And now you had indicated that most of the children did have living parents, but for those who were really true orphans in the sense that we usually use that word today, what typically happened after they reached a certain age or had been there a certain number of years?
Well, I want to say first that there weren't a whole lot of kids who aged out. They stayed until about the end of 8th grade, and they often went into service. Young women, they might become maids. They might, go to work at maybe Palmer Candy. They would often go to work. The young women into some kind of domestic service. Again, this is a pretty small number of young women, and they could start working and continue to stay there in the orphanage for a while. So they didn't get kicked out.
Mm-hmm. That's
right
what I was
away.
picturing.
So the boys also, would go to work. Sometimes they went to work on farms because 12-year-old working on the farm was pretty normal. And sometimes, if a child continued to need care, they would be sent to Omaha because Boys Town was established and was very large and had the capacity to take boys from different places. There was also a facility for young women in Omaha that was run by the same order of Franciscans. So there would be a continuity of culture there if they went from St. Anthony's here to Omaha.
So that's so interesting to hear of the connections, even with the Boys Town and Omaha and so forth, much less the Catholic Charities angle. So there's just such a rich history, and I would say quality care assisting the vulnerable populations. You just kind of have in your mind maybe a different scenario, like you mentioned, the Charles Dickens. So a lot of this centered in Sioux City, and as you said, really affected areas quite outside of our diocese. So we know from what you've said that Catholic Charities was involved in St. Monica, Good Shepherd, St. Anthony. So what was happening in society that maybe precipitated the change? And obviously those three entities no longer exist in those forms.
Well, before I answer that question, which is a really good one, I'd like to mention that these kids at St. Anthony's were going to school there. So the sisters who were taking care of them were also their teachers. So there was elementary school and middle school classes going on there. Also, I think, I forgot to mention that from the very beginning, Bishop Garrigan was really emphatic that all of these institutions would accept people in need, regardless of their religion, regardless of their race. And we know from the photographs that survive that there was no segregation in these institutions, where, again, I think, these sisters were really on the ball.
Yes.
That everyone involved was really recognizing the dignity of the people that they were serving.
So back to that, wonderful work done there, and it does make sense that they would have educated those students as well. But what kind of things were happening in our society or in Northwest Iowa that precipitated some change?
Well, there were a couple of different factors. Part of it was that standards of care changed. The orphanages all over the United States were getting phased out in the late 50s and early 60s. They were largely being replaced by the foster care system, which was run by the counties or the states. And so the church wasn't really involved with those very much. And something similar was happening with unwed mothers and women who were at risk, young women at risk. So there were different models, and it was becoming much more of a secular model rather than something that the church was directly involved with. The sisters, I think they moved. I'm pretty sure that the sisters, when these institutions closed, just went home to their mother houses. So like the Franciscans went back to Dubuque, or that's what most likely happened, is they went back to Dubuque. But of course we have the other communities. We have Briarcliff and other ways for them to serve in this area. I mean, I'm sure they had roots here too. The other thing that happened is that, unfortunately, a lot of buildings that were built in the early 20th century in Sioux City started falling down because the bricks that were locally made, most of them were made up in Leeds in the north part of Sioux City, they're very soft. So these and building codes changed significantly between 1910 and 1960. So suddenly we had kind of the perfect storm where there's been a change in the model of care to a more secular model. These buildings are starting to really deteriorate, and then code has changed for what these buildings are supposed to have. So these things all work together to close all three of these institutes within just a couple of years of each other in the early 60s.
Which in a way wasn't all that long ago, but yes, and yet it is. And if I understand correctly, that St. Anthony's was on the site north of where Catholic Charities is today. Is that correct, on that hill?
Yes. It's a nice hill between Briarcliff and where Catholic Charities and the cemetery is. So there was a big hill, and it was perched on top of the hill, and there was actually a streetcar that went there, so people could easily visit the kids. The streetcar went right to the bottom of the hill, and then it was just a walk up through the garden area that they had, because they had a big garden and orchard and actually small farm, so they were milking cows. On the way up to the house, because parents visited. Parents came and saw their kids pretty regularly.
It's fascinating. It's not what you consider, but that's fascinating.
and it's now property of in care of the city as a nature preserve. It's a prairie parkland there now.
Interesting. So as these things happened and immigration kind of slowed down a little bit in that time frame, and how did Catholic Charities kind of come into play as we think of them now in assisting the bishop in serving our families and those in need?
Well, again, my records of this are not going to be as complete as theirs, so I hope sometime soon you'll ask Catholic Charities that question. And I actually have just a few numbers for that. So I know this because we have a newspaper clipping from 1926. And in 1926, it was covering the first 16 years that the home was opened. And there were 702 babies born during those 16 years.
Oh my.
And of those 702, 274 of them had been adopted. That was also a bit of a surprise. I expected that figure would be higher.
Certainly.
I did as well.
So, unfortunately, because of the strict confidentiality surrounding the situation at the time and the fact that so few records exist, we can't really say how many mothers and babies assisted. I mean, just based on this figure from 26, I assume it to have been thousands. But we can't really say for sure.
That's quite an impressive number in any case.
Yes. But a lot of times, something had gone wrong with these people's families, and they needed help. And so the church was helping, and Catholic Charities was part of the help, and often doing paperwork and helping with the administrative side of things. And what's really changed now is that Catholic Charities is involved with preventive ministry so that families don't fall apart, doing important work with addiction treatment, which of course, helps people get their lives together, helps families stay together, helps people recover from traumatic events like the flooding we've had and things like that. So the work that Catholic Charities has done, from my limited perspective, is that it has become much more focused on preventing the sort of situations that these institutions were responding to.
A little proactive. It's interesting to look back at that work, and again, and I think you mentioned always with a focus on the dignity of the human person, yes. No matter what had happened to them, what situations they were in, and we certainly see that with Catholic Charities today, and the dignity of their clients. There's offices in communities around the diocese, and then the office here in Sioux City, they're adding Angeline's Wing to further serve children and families. Again, just carrying on that theme of helping families in need. That's getting close to completion. So yes, we'll have Amy Block and some of her staff come in and talk about that and some of the wonderful work that they do, and also working the Welcome program with working with immigrants and refugees in need of immigration legal help or any other assistance. We've had a lot of Catholic Charities staff come in because they do so many different things,
which is wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the Lumen coverage of that.
Yes,
and collecting that for the archives.
And we're glad you do.
And it's really a privilege to have care of this information, to have to take care of these records, which are fragile and delicate, and they need some special handling, and they need a little bit of interpretation. But it's wonderful work to be able to care for this heritage of care and cooperation and community involvement. It's really very moving stuff to handle. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. The archives are supported by the generosity of the faithful in the Diocese of Sioux City. We're funded by the Together as One campaign, and I'm really happy that I can share just a little bit of the great history that we have, and that keeping it in good condition and hopefully making it a little more available to the faithful is something I'd really like to do.
And I will say that whenever we need something, like Cecilia, do you have a picture of of Father so-and-so when he served in World War II? And boom, she's got a picture, and then here's a little anecdotal information about it. And she's been a really great resource for us in the communications office. So
that's my pleasure.
So glad.
Well, thank you so much, Cecilia, for your time today, and for sharing with us the history within the diocese, but also I think specifically in the figures of Bishop Garrigan and Mother Gertrude. We often hear about saints who lived in other parts of the world, but really in our own heritage here, we have some really holy men and women who lived out that life of mission and the works of mercy. So thank you so much for sharing, and may they intercede for us, God willing, they are in heaven above, and so thank you so much for all of that and for sharing your knowledge. And thank you to all of our listeners for taking time to listen to today's Illuminating Catholics episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and that you enjoyed learning more about our history. New episodes drop each Tuesday wherever you get your podcasts or at lumenmedia.org.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Follow us for more episodes on topics of the Catholic faith. For more diocesan news, visit lumenmedia.org.